I never imagined I'd end up in a situation like this. It wasn't something I'd ever planned for or even thought about, but life has a way of throwing curveballs you never see coming. It all started on a regular afternoon, the kind of day that should have been forgettable. But that day stuck with me. It changed everything. Narrator comment, looking back, I can't help but wonder if I missed the signs earlier. Maybe I did. Maybe I just didn't want to see them. The house was quiet, just the low hum of the AC and the occasional chirp of birds outside. I'd just finished cleaning up the kitchen when I felt someone watching me. Not just a quick glance, but a steady, intense stare. When I turned around, there he was, my stepson, Ethan. Now, Ethan had always been a good kid. Polite, respectful, the type who'd hold doors open and say, "Thank you," without being reminded. But lately, there was something different in the way he looked at me. At first, I told myself it was nothing. He was 22, stuck in that weird phase between being a kid and a full-grown adult, still figuring out his place in the world. He'd always been close to his dad, but since my husband, Daniel, had been traveling more for work, Ethan had been spending more time around me. I didn't mind, I liked the company. But this was different. His gaze wasn't casual. It was direct, focused, like he was trying to figure me out, waiting to see how I'd react. I felt this weird mix of unease and something else I couldn't quite name. "Do you need something?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He paused for a second, then shook his head. "No, just thinking." Thinking about what? I could have asked, but deep down, I already knew. And maybe, just maybe, part of me wanted to hear him say it out loud. Instead, I turned back to the sink, staring at the soapy water swirling down the drain. Dinner that night should have been uneventful. The TV was on in the background, and I sat across from Ethan at the table. I asked him about his classes, his summer plans. He answered, but there was this edge in his voice, something I hadn't noticed before. And the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for something, some kind of opening. Later that night, after I'd gone upstairs, there was a knock at my bedroom door. It was late, way too late for casual conversation. I hesitated before opening it, my breath catching a little when I saw him standing there. He looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know how to start. He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I'm doing." Narrator comment, honestly, neither did I. But I knew we were standing on the edge of something we shouldn't have been. Something that was starting to blur the lines. "Ethan," I said carefully, "this isn't." "I know," he cut in. "But that doesn't change anything, does it?" His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I should have stepped back, shut the door, put an end to whatever was happening before it went too far. But instead, I stayed right where I was, watching him, waiting. "Good night," he finally said, his voice softer now, like he'd come to some quiet decision. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart racing. I closed the door, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the look in his eyes, the tension in his voice. It was wrong. It was dangerous. It was something I should have never let happen. And yet, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The night before kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something irreversible. I tried to go about my morning routine like nothing had happened, hoping if I pretended hard enough, it would all just fade away. But when I walked downstairs and saw Ethan in the kitchen, I knew I was wrong. He was leaning against the counter, a coffee mug in his hands, watching me with that same intensity I'd felt the night before. "Morning," he said casually, like nothing had changed. "Morning," I echoed, forcing a smile. I poured myself a cup of coffee, careful not to look at him for too long. If I let him see the thoughts swirling in my head, I wasn't sure I'd be able to take them back. I sat at the table, hoping the tension would fade if I kept my distance. But Ethan didn't leave. Instead, he sat across from me, taking slow sips of his coffee. "You didn't sleep much," he finally said. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. What makes you say that? I could hear you moving around. You were up late. He was watching me again, that same searching look that made my stomach tighten. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice light. Just had trouble settling down, I guess. Nothing unusual. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, setting his mug down. Was it because of me? There it was, the question I'd been dreading, the one that would pull me further into this dangerous place if I wasn't careful. Ethan, I said, my voice steady despite the way my hands clenched in my lap, I think we need to be careful here. I know things feel different lately, but they don't just feel different. They are different, he interrupted. I swallowed hard. That doesn't mean we have to act on it. He studied me for a long moment, and for a second, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe he'd nod, say he understood, and we could go back to the way things were before. But then he stood up, slowly and deliberately, and moved around the table toward me. My breath caught as he placed a hand on the back of my chair, his body close enough that I could feel his warmth. You don't really believe that, do you? He murmured. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to stop this, to get up and put distance between us. But I didn't move. I couldn't. He reached out, the barest brush of his fingers against my arm, and I felt the air in the room shift. Ethan, I breathed, my voice barely audible. He waited, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to give him permission. And for one terrifying, exhilarating moment, I wanted to. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. I jerked back just as my husband, Daniel, stepped into the house, setting his briefcase down with a sigh. Hey, sweetheart, he called. Sorry I got back so late. Traffic was awful. I shot up from my chair, my pulse racing. You're home early. He smiled and walked over to kiss my cheek, completely oblivious to the storm that had just been brewing in the room. Meetings wrapped up quicker than expected. Thought I'd surprise you. That's nice, I managed, forcing a smile. Ethan had moved away, his expression unreadable, but I could still feel the tension lingering in the air. I could still feel the weight of what had almost happened between us. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I wouldn't let it go any further. But standing there with my husband, Daniel, just a few feet away, I knew deep down it wasn't over. Not even close. Narrator comment, funny how the mind works, isn't it? You convince yourself you're in control, but the truth has a way of sneaking up on you. The rest of that evening, I avoided Ethan like the plague. Every time our eyes met, I felt like Daniel would somehow see right through me, like the guilt of what had almost happened was written all over my face. I buried myself in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. But I could still feel Ethan's presence in the room. The way he lingered, his attention never straying far from me. Dinner was a quiet affair, with Daniel completely oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. He was too busy talking about his meetings, the problems at work, and his plans for the week. Ethan barely spoke, answering in short, clipped responses, his fork pushing food around his plate. I wasn't much better. My mind was racing, my body tense, every nerve hyper-aware of him sitting just across the table. After dinner, Daniel flopped onto the couch, exhausted from his long day, flipping through TV channels without much focus. I excused myself to the kitchen, pretending to clean up but really just trying to gather my thoughts. The moment I was alone, I let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the counter. I needed space, time, clarity, but I wasn't given any of those things. I felt him before I heard him. Ethan's presence was unmistakable, the subtle shift of energy in the room sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't turn around, but I knew he was standing behind me. We need to talk, he said softly. Not now, I whispered back, my fingers tightening around the dish towel in my hands. Then when? His voice was low, persistent, and entirely too close. This can't happen, I said, my voice barely audible. It was a mistake. We need to forget about it. You don't believe that, he countered, stepping closer. I see it in your eyes. I shut my eyes, willing myself to find the strength to push him away, to put an end to whatever this was before it went any further. But when I opened them and turned to face him, the words caught in my throat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something deeper, something dangerous, a challenge. "Ethan," I started, but a noise from the living room made us both freeze. Daniel laughed at something on the TV, completely unaware of what was unfolding just feet away from him. The spell broke, and I exhaled shakily, stepping back. "Go to bed," I said firmly. "This conversation is over." He hesitated, his jaw tightening, but after a long moment, he nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing up the stairs. I leaned against the counter, my pulse hammering. I'd put an end to it. I'd drawn a line. But deep down, I knew that line had already started to blur the moment I let myself entertain the thought of something more. Narrator comment: funny how easy it is to lie to yourself when you're desperate to believe it. The days that followed were filled with unbearable tension. Ethan was always there, his presence a constant reminder of what had nearly happened. He didn't push, didn't corner me again, but the silence between us was thick with unspoken words. Daniel left for another business trip that Friday, kissing my cheek before heading out the door with his suitcase in hand. "Call me if you need anything," he said, smiling warmly. I nodded, forcing a smile. "I will. Be safe." The moment the door shut behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And then I felt it, the weight of someone watching me. I turned, and there he was, standing at the foot of the stairs. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence stretched between us, filled with the unspeakable things neither of us dared to acknowledge out loud. I knew in that moment that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't take back, and I didn't know if I wanted to stop myself from falling. The house felt different with Daniel gone. It was quieter, the silence almost thick with anticipation. I knew Ethan was still in the house, but he hadn't said a word since Daniel left that morning. The tension between us had only grown, unspoken yet undeniable, lurking in the air like an unseen force, pulling me closer to something I knew I shouldn't want. I busied myself with mindless tasks, hoping distractions would dull the thoughts creeping into my mind. I cleaned the counters, rearranged the spice rack, even folded laundry that didn't need folding. But nothing could stop my mind from drifting to him. The clock struck noon, and I realized I hadn't seen Ethan all morning. Had he left? Was he avoiding me? A sense of relief mixed with disappointment settled in my chest. I shook my head, scolding myself for caring at all. I needed space, time to clear my head before I did something I couldn't take back. I made my way to the living room and sank onto the couch, hoping a little TV would serve as a good distraction. But just as I reached for the remote, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I turned my head, and there he was. Ethan stood at the bottom step, watching me. He looked like he'd been deep in thought, his hands resting on the banister as if debating whether to come closer. My pulse quickened. "You've been avoiding me," I said, immediately regretting the words. "I thought that's what you wanted," he replied, his voice even, unreadable. I swallowed hard. I don't know what's happening between us." He took a step forward, his expression calm but deliberate. "I think you do." I exhaled sharply, my hands tightening in my lap. "Ethan, this can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes locked onto mine. "You keep pretending you don't feel it, but I see it." "I feel it." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. I felt it, and denying it only made it stronger. He took another step toward me, and I knew I should stand up, create distance, end whatever was happening before it spiraled further out of control. But I didn't move. "You're scared," he said, his voice softer now. "Not because this is wrong, but because you don't know if you can stop yourself." My breath caught in my throat. "Ethan." Before I could finish, he was standing in front of me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. My pulse hammered in my chest. "I'm not going to do anything you don't want," he murmured, his gaze unwavering. "But you need to be honest with yourself." I closed my eyes, trying to push away the emotions swirling inside me. This wasn't just about temptation. It was about the undeniable connection that had been building between us, a connection I'd tried so hard to ignore. When I opened my eyes, he was still watching me, waiting for my response. And I didn't know if I had the strength to give him the answer he deserved. It wasn't about whether it felt wrong. It was about the consequences, the weight of choices that could never be taken back. I shook my head. It doesn't matter. We can't. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, didn't move. He just studied me with a patience that made my stomach twist into knots. Then, as if coming to some decision, he stepped back. Fine, he said. I blinked. The space between us suddenly felt too much, too empty. Fine, he repeated, nodding, his gaze still unreadable. If you really believe that we should ignore this, that it's nothing, then I'll drop it. I won't bring it up again. Relief should have washed over me. I should have felt lighter, reassured that he was giving me an out, an escape from something I had no business entertaining. But all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. I gave a slow nod, ignoring the disappointment curling in my stomach. That's for the best. A flicker of something passed over his face, something I couldn't quite place. He turned then, walking toward the stairs without another word. I didn't stop him. I didn't call him back. I just stood there, watching him disappear, feeling the weight of something unfinished pressing down on me. Narrator comment: funny how the things we think we want don't always feel the way we expect them to. The house felt different after that. The silence between us wasn't just thick, it was impenetrable. Ethan kept his distance. Not cold, not cruel, but distant enough that I felt the absence of his presence in every room. I told myself this was what I wanted, that this was the right choice. But every time I caught him looking at me from across the house, that same unreadable expression in his eyes, I wondered if right was the same thing as bearable. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Ethan kept his word. He didn't bring it up again, didn't push, didn't cross any lines. But the air between us remained charged, thick with everything unsaid. I should have felt relief. Maybe even gratitude that he'd taken a step back. But instead, I felt something else entirely, something that unsettled me far more than the guilt I'd expected to feel. I missed it. I missed the weight of his gaze, the way he challenged me, the way he forced me to acknowledge what was happening instead of running from it. Without him in my space, the house felt emptier, the hours stretched too long, and I found myself waiting for something I'd already told myself could never happen. I threw myself into distractions. I went out more often, running errands that didn't need to be run, finding reasons to be anywhere but alone in the house with my thoughts. When I was home, I busied myself with chores, cooking elaborate meals that no one had asked for, anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. But nothing helped. Because no matter how much I tried to pretend otherwise, I knew the truth. I wanted him. And knowing that he'd let go, that he'd decided to stop pushing, didn't make it easier. It made it worse. Because now I was the one thinking about what if. I was the one fighting the urge to cross the line I'd so firmly drawn. Late one evening, after I'd spent the day avoiding him as much as he'd been avoiding me, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, trying to focus on the rhythmic sound of water instead of the restlessness coiling inside me. When I turned, he was there, standing in the doorway. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. Something wrong? My voice was steady, but my pulse was anything but. No, he said, his expression unreadable. Just thought maybe you were done avoiding me. I swallowed hard. I'm not avoiding you. He arched a brow, clearly unconvinced. Right. That's why you've barely said a word to me in days. I turned back to the sink, focusing on scrubbing the plate in my hand even though it was already clean. I just think it's for the best. Do you? He stepped inside the kitchen, moving closer, not too close, but close enough that I felt the heat of his presence. Because it sure doesn't look like you do. I turned off the faucet and exhaled slowly before facing him. Ethan, we agreed. No, he cut in smoothly. You agreed. I just didn't fight you on it. I pressed my lips together, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Isn't that the same thing? Not even close. He studied me, his gaze slow and assessing. You want me to act like there's nothing here, but I know better. And so do you. A shiver ran down my spine, but I held firm. That doesn't mean we have to do anything about it. He took a step closer, close enough now that I could see the challenge in his eyes, the frustration just beneath the surface. Then why are you still standing here? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because there was no answer that wouldn't unravel everything. He tilted his head slightly, waiting, giving me one last chance to push him away. But I didn't. And that was all the answer he needed. The moment stretched between us, neither of us moving, neither of us daring to breathe too hard. I could feel the weight of his stare, the way it settled on me, daring me to break first. And maybe I already had. Maybe I'd been breaking for a while now, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the inevitable. I could have walked away. I could have pushed him back, ended the moment before it had a chance to take root. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would force me to make a decision I wasn't ready to make. You don't want me to walk away, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the edge of the counter. Ethan, this isn't. Don't say it's wrong, he interrupted, his voice low and insistent. You don't believe that. I exhaled sharply, my chest tightening. And for a brief second, I closed my eyes, trying to collect myself. The room felt smaller, the air heavier with every second that passed. It doesn't matter what I believe, I said, my voice strained. What matters is what's right. He took a step forward, the space between us closing with every movement. It felt as though the distance was vanishing, leaving only the undeniable weight of our shared silence. And this feels wrong to you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper yet somehow still loud enough to make my heart race. I didn't respond immediately, because in truth, I couldn't lie. Not to him. Not to myself. We both knew the answer. It didn't feel wrong. If anything, it felt inevitable, like something that had been slowly building, threading its way through every glance, every unspoken word, every moment we'd shared over time. Something I'd fought against, ignored, and denied. Yet it had been there all along, waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. Then stop pretending, he murmured, stepping even closer until I could feel the heat of his body, the subtle rhythm of his breath. His words pierced through me, the way they always did, sending a shiver rippling down my spine. My resolve, which had been so firm just moments before, suddenly felt fragile, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The air around us seemed to crackle, thick with something electric, something dangerous. And I knew in that instant that the line we'd drawn between us, whatever it had been, no longer existed. It was gone. Erased by the weight of everything unspoken, everything we'd both been trying to avoid. Tell me to leave, Ethan said, his voice softer now, gentler, almost a plea. And I will. I turned to face him fully, really looking at him for the first time in what felt like weeks. In that moment, everything else faded away, the doubts, the hesitations, the walls I'd carefully constructed to keep myself from feeling this. And there it was, right in front of me, the truth. The tension between us had been building for so long, I couldn't even pinpoint when it started. The stolen glances, the way my pulse quickened every time he was near, the subtle way our bodies seemed to gravitate toward each other despite the distance we tried to maintain. It was undeniable. Impossible to ignore. I'd known it for a while, but I hadn't let myself face it, until now. But even as I acknowledged it, I couldn't bring myself to speak the words. I couldn't say it out loud, couldn't tell him to leave, because deep down, I didn't want him to. And that silence, that single moment where I didn't say the words I knew I should, was all the answer he needed. He saw it in the way my eyes softened, in the way my breath hitched. I'd crossed the line. The tension between us, which had been lingering in the background, was no longer a mere presence. It was suffocating. It was consuming everything around us, tightening its grip with every passing second until it felt like there was no room to breathe, no room to think. It wasn't something we could escape from. It was swallowing us whole, pulling us deeper into something neither of us could deny, and yet neither of us could fully stop. His presence, so close now, felt like it was inside me, every inch of him drawing me in. But still, he stood there, waiting, giving me one last chance to change my mind. I could feel the weight of that choice pressing on me, and for a moment, my heart raced with fear, with longing, with everything I knew I wasn't ready to face. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't tell him to leave. I couldn't. And that was it. The moment we both understood. Ethan's breath was steady, calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I could feel all the way down to my bones. His hands were at his sides, controlled, restrained, but I could sense the raw energy coiled beneath the surface, ready to burst free. The air around us seemed to thicken, the silence stretching out between us like a taut wire. I could feel the heat radiating off him, his presence pressing in on me, the warmth of it igniting every nerve in my body. My skin burned with the awareness that this was the moment where everything, all the walls I'd built around myself, would finally come crashing down. I could almost taste the change, bitter and sweet all at once. I took a slow, deliberate step back, creating just enough space between us for the tension to still hang heavy in the air but not enough for it to break. The gap between us was a fragile thing, an invisible line that threatened to shatter the moment it was crossed. "We can't come back from this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, a fragile thread of sound that seemed to echo in the stillness between us. Ethan's response was immediate, his words crisp, unwavering, filled with a certainty that both terrified and excited me. "I don't want to." The finality in his tone cut through the haze of doubt that had clouded my mind. And just like that, the last thread of my resistance snapped, breaking apart like brittle glass. There was no turning back now. I'd spent so long pretending, convincing myself that I could ignore the pull between us, fighting against something that had already taken root deep inside me. I'd clung to every excuse, every rationalization, every logical reason why this couldn't happen. But with each passing day, the weight of it grew heavier. The denial had become a cage I could no longer bear to live in. Every argument I'd made to myself, every carefully constructed reason why I shouldn't feel what I felt, crumbled in an instant under the undeniable gravity of what had always been there. I tried to convince myself that if I kept my distance, kept my focus on anything else, the way he looked at me, the way his presence seemed to consume the space around him, would somehow fade. But I'd been lying to myself. All the careful barriers I'd built, all the walls I'd constructed to keep him at arm's length, had been nothing but illusions. The truth had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for this moment. Ethan moved closer, the space between us shrinking with each slow, deliberate step he took. His fingers brushed against my arm, a light touch, almost tentative, as if he were waiting for me to pull away, to push him back, to reject what was happening. But I didn't. I didn't pull away. Instead, I tilted my head, my eyes meeting his, and in that gaze, I saw the same thing reflected back at me, the same desire, the same need. I knew in that moment that the decision had already been made. The moment I moved, the moment I let myself give into the pull between us, there would be no turning back. I would cross a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. And then I did. The world around us seemed to blur, the edges of reality softening like watercolor bleeding into water. Logic, reason, all of it slipped through my fingers like sand, dissolving into nothingness. The noise of my thoughts quieted, replaced by the pounding of my heart and the rush of sensation that flooded my body. For the first time in months, I stopped thinking. I stopped analyzing. I stopped worrying about what came next, what the consequences would be. The weight of it, the guilt, the fear, they all melted away. In that moment, there was only the now. Only him and me, caught in the space between what was and what could be. Time moved differently after that. It warped, bending and twisting into something unrecognizable. Moments bled into days, and days slipped into something more elusive, something between the mundane and the extraordinary. Everything felt heightened, as though the world itself had shifted just a little, and now nothing could be the same. I couldn't stop myself from wanting more, from seeking out excuses to be near him, to feel the heat of his presence, to share the same air, to exist in the same space where this unspoken connection had been simmering for so long, always just beneath the surface. The more time passed, the more it consumed me, a hunger I couldn't satisfy, a craving I couldn't ignore. But reality, as it always does, has a way of creeping back in. No matter how much you try to shut it out, no matter how far you run from it, it has a way of reminding you of your obligations, of your commitments, of everything you've tried to hide from. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything changed again. The house was still, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when the world outside is distant and far away. My husband had returned late the night before, blissfully unaware of the shift that had happened, the subtle change in the air, the secret that had rooted itself beneath his own roof, buried just beneath the surface. He kissed my cheek as he left for a round of golf, his touch warm and familiar, a routine gesture that had once felt like home. But now, in that moment, his presence felt distant, foreign, even as if a barrier had quietly, imperceptibly risen between us. He didn't know. Couldn't know. That something had shifted, something irreversible. I watched him go, his figure disappearing out the door, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever be able to look at him the same way again. The guilt should have overwhelmed me. It should have consumed me entirely, shattered the fragile little world I'd so carefully built around myself, cracking it into pieces too small to ever be put back together. But it didn't. It lingered. A shadow in the corners of my mind, not powerful enough to break me yet, but always present, always gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. And the fact that it hadn't destroyed me, hadn't crushed me beneath its weight, terrified me more than anything else. More than the guilt itself. It was as if I'd learned to live with it. As if a part of me had grown numb to the very thing that should have torn me apart. Ethan was sitting in the living room when I stepped inside. His silhouette was visible against the soft glow of the lamp beside him. His posture was casual, slouched as if he didn't have a care in the world. But his eyes, those eyes were anything but relaxed. They were sharp, piercing through me in a way I could never escape. His gaze had always had a way of cutting through the layers I put up, of seeing right into the heart of whatever turmoil I tried so desperately to hide. And in that moment, I knew, without him saying a single word, that he could feel the storm raging inside me. He could sense it as clearly as if I'd been wearing my emotions like a cloak. I took a breath, my voice coming out quieter than I intended, barely more than a whisper. But the weight of the words hung in the air between us like an unspoken confession. We can't keep doing this. The words felt weak, hollow, as though I were trying to make sense of something that had long since ceased to make sense. They didn't carry the conviction I needed them to, and they felt as fragile as the thin thread holding my resolve together. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me, his gaze unwavering, taking in every minute detail, the slight tremor in my hands, the way my chest rose and fell with each breath, the way I avoided his eyes. I could see the wheels turning behind those sharp eyes, and I braced myself for the inevitable. But when he finally spoke, his voice was measured, calm, almost too calm. I know. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a plea. It was an acknowledgement. But it wasn't enough to make it feel final. There was no closure in his words, no sense of resolution, just a simple truth hanging in the air. And that, more than anything else, kept me anchored in place, unable to move forward, unable to let go. A silence stretched out between us, thick and suffocating, filling the space with all the things we hadn't said, all the emotions we'd refused to acknowledge. The silence wasn't comfortable. It wasn't peaceful. It was an oppressive weight pressing down on both of us, keeping us suspended in a place where neither of us was willing to take the next step. I turned toward the door, my body moving almost on instinct. But then, as if sensing my intention, his voice cut through the stillness, stopping me in my tracks. Do you regret it? His words were quiet, but they held the kind of weight that made me freeze, made my heart race and my throat tighten. There it was, the question I'd been avoiding, the one that had been haunting me since the moment it all began. I should have said yes. I should have seized that moment to make it clear, to shut the door on everything that had been lingering between us. I should have used those 2 little letters to make the guilt go away, to finally end what had been left unsaid for so long. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself caught between the truth and the lie, between what I should have said and what I knew was still simmering beneath the surface. "I don't know," I murmured, my voice barely audible, as if the words themselves were too fragile to be spoken out loud. "But I don't think I will." And even as I said them, I knew there was more to it, more I wasn't ready to confront, more that had already taken root inside me. Things I wasn't prepared to admit. Not yet. The answer hung between us, a soft echo in the silence, neither comforting nor condemning. It was the only truth I could give him in that moment. But it was enough to leave everything still hanging in the air, unresolved, unfinished, waiting for something to give. Narrator comment: funny how the hardest truths are the ones we can't even say out loud. Maybe that's why they linger the longest. Thank you for watching until the end. If you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you so much.